Satya, we are so excited to have you today, as you can see. You've said that Microsoft's mission is not to be cool, it's to make others cool. But Bob Dylan is playing across campus today, and you sold out faster than him, so we certainly think Microsoft is cool. Really, though, we are so grateful to you for making the time to be with us, and we have a lot to cover. But I thought we could start with your childhood in India. You've said that your father never met a test he didn't ace, while your mother was the opposite of a tiger mom. I love that contrast, and I'm curious how their different life philosophies shaped you.
First of all, thank you so much, Tara, for having me here. It's great to be at the GSB, and Bob Dylan was my idol, so times must be changing. It's interesting. In fact, my father passed away just last month, and I've been reflecting quite a bit on what both my parents have meant to me. My father was a Marxist economist and a civil servant, and he had a definitive point of view on what life was all about and the struggle of life. And he's right. I mean, the guy always used to look at my scorecards and used to be amazed that somebody could be that bad. But luckily enough, I think in some sense he gave me, in spite of all of that, a lot of confidence, because to him, he felt like, look, it's a marathon. You'll catch up. This is not that hard. And my mother was exactly the opposite. Of course, the only question she would ever ask me is, are you happy? And I would say, what the heck does that mean? Like, when you're reading my scorecard, I don't know whether I should be happy or not. But again, the two of them, I think, when I look back, growing up in Hyderabad in India in the late 70s, early 80s, interestingly enough, there are 3 or 4 of us who now suddenly have become CEOs from the same high school in this, at that time, what was off-the-grid place. I think it was that ability to think, that ability to pursue your own passions, and have, enough confidence as well as some humility, as sort of, when I look back, have been, perhaps the biggest drivers of what's sort of turned out to be a reasonable, set of things.
Absolutely, yeah. It's really clear how much your parents influenced you, and another foundational influence for you was sports. Now, my fellow international classmates and I, we're mystified daily by American sports references, so we're very happy to talk about cricket.
Yeah.
You love cricket, and you dreamt of playing professionally. What lessons did you take from the pitch?
Well, I mean, all of us who are South Asian are obsessed with that sport, and, it's sort of, in fact, that's right. I mean, that was what I was pretty much all bound up in all through my high school, into college. And, when I look back, I think all sport teaches you a lot. And especially, at least, I feel team sport, I think, has a huge impact in how you think about leadership. I'll never forget this one particular incident that I've, I think, subsequently written about. There was this guy who was my school captain who went on to do pretty well in the context of Indian cricket. I was bowling trash that day, and he took over from me, got a wicket, which is a breakthrough, but then he gave me the ball back, and then I went on to have perhaps the best bowling spell I've ever had in my life. And I've always reflected as to why did he do that? And then, in fact, much later on in life, I went back and asked him even. And so at least the way I surmise it was a leadership decision he made of saying, look, I recognize that this guy's, he had recognized the importance of not breaking my confidence. And I said, look, well, that's a pretty enlightened decision for a high school leader, captain of a cricket team to make. And a lot of leadership lessons is that, right? Which is you got to make hard calls on, say, performance. But also, you got to be able to sort of understand that you need your team, and it's not like everybody's going to have a good day all the time. And that subtle distinction and that judgment, right, which is one of the things that I feel, which is the most understated part of leadership, is judgment. And it's so important. And that judgment comes by you exercising this muscle around passing judgment and learning from it. And I thought that's one of the lessons I learned.
He was building your confidence in a way
right.
by making you.
That's right.
So you didn't end up playing professional cricket, sadly.
Here I am.
But you did make your way to the US, and soon after you started your own family. And in reading your book, something that really moved me was how much you talk about your family and the role they've played bringing empathy into your life. Could you share with us how being a parent has shaped you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very big part of what has perhaps shaped my worldview. And for both my wife and me, both my wife and I grew up together. We went to the same schools. And we were the only children of our parents. So when we were both in our late 20s, when our first son was about to be born, we were very excited. The household was all about, my wife's an architect, and so she was practicing at that time. And so my only concern was, when will Anu go back to school? I would go back to work, and how are we going to think about the baby's daycare and what have you? And lo and behold, one night, there was some complications, and our son Zain was born. Because of some complications, he now has cerebral palsy. He has quadriplegia and is locked in. And I would say for the first maybe as many as 5 years, I struggled with it, primarily because I felt that all these plans that I had for what our life was going to be like had taken a real turn. And then I watched Anu go up and down 520 in Seattle, taking him to every therapy possible, speech, occupational. And then I was just watching it and still moaning my own sort of whatever issues. But then it dawned on me that nothing actually happened to me. Something had happened to my son, and that I needed to, as a father, step up and do my duty. In other words, it is the harsh but real lesson around being able to see the world through the eyes of my son. Right? That's what empathy is all about. And I think that's what it is. I mean, it's innate in us all as humans. I think empathy is something that we are all very capable of. Life teaches us that. And in small ways and in tough ways. Like I remember even the last interview by the last interviewer when I was interviewing at Microsoft was also a life-changing moment for me. So I went through this interview. It was all code on screen at that time, and so this guy sort of says, "Hey, here's a question for you. You're at the crossroads. A baby falls and is crying. What will you do?" And I say, wow, this is some search algorithm I didn't learn. It must be some variant of some traveling salesman problem or something. And I sort of really thought about it for a few minutes. And then I said, I'll go to the phone booth and call 911. This was pre-smartphone. So he gets up, he escorts me out, and he says, you know what? You need to develop some empathy. Because when a baby falls, you pick them up and hug them first before you call. And I thought, that's it. I'm definitely not going to get this job. And lo and behold, I did get the job. But nevertheless, I mean, I really think that that's so core. And some people say, well, like, what does that have to do with sort of business? Or what does it have to do with work? And I believe it has everything to do with work. I believe if you sort of say innovation is all about meeting unmet, unarticulated needs of customers, where is that source of your ability to get in touch with that unmet, unarticulated need going to come from? It's going to come from your ability to, in some sense, be able to listen between the lines, to be able to extrapolate. And that's, to me, deep sense of empathy, right? So people talk about design thinking. I think design thinking is empathy. And so therefore, I do believe that, life teaches you empathy, and, empathy is the source to success in any innovative agenda you have.
It's inspiring to hear you say that you think empathy is innate when we're living in a world where sometimes it feels like empathy is on the decline. So I think your point around empathy is really well taken.
It's a great question because, in fact, it is such a big word, and it is hard. In fact, even recently at Microsoft, we realized that it's important for us to even understand what are the necessary conditions to even develop empathy. So one of the words we have developed, we've put into our sort of parlance is respect. For example, if you don't start from a place of having some respect for the other person's views, where they come from, their complete history, it's very hard to develop empathy. So therefore, I think you're absolutely right to say, before you think about some of these higher level things, you have to sort of even question what are the basics that we need to get right.
Absolutely. And that's become so core to your leadership at Microsoft. So if we turn now to Microsoft, before you were CEO, you took this job leading Microsoft's first real cloud business. And Steve Ballmer apparently told you this might be your last job at Microsoft because if you fail, there's no parachute. That feels like a lot of pressure. Why did you make that jump?
Steve, who went to school here, had many. He just went for 1 year, from what I understand. Oh, this is the funniest thing. I should say this. I guess the other guy who went to school here was Mukesh Ambani. So I believe one day Steve Ballmer was introducing Mukesh in Bombay, and he joked that both of us dropped out of GSB, except that Mukesh had never told anybody that he had dropped out of GSB. So there was a real scandal. And so Steve, wanted us to really take this new business area, which was our online business. In fact, Susan, who's here, and I worked on it for a long time as well. And he felt that, look, this was a place where we needed to make progress. And Steve had this very clear sense of what it means to succeed. And his point was, you're going to go learn a lot. And of course, I'll fire you if you don't do a good job with it. And it was sort of a way for him to perhaps communicate both why he as the CEO cared about this business and at the same time his expectations. But I must say that particular tour of duty has been the most influential in how I've sort of thought about whether it's distributed computing at its core, whether it's the economic models that are going to be emergent. And that has been very, very helpful. Doing different things inside the company has helped me grow to run the company eventually. So, I actually appreciate Steve both giving me that opportunity and, more importantly, giving me the message that, look, at the end of the day, it's performance that matters.
Really? Did you know at the time that decision was putting you on a path to one day becoming the CEO?
No way. Most people ask me this, which is like, hey, did you have a sense that you'll become CEO? No. First of all, none of us grew up even. To us, especially having grown up at Microsoft, I don't think I even thought of a Microsoft where Bill and Steve were not actively engaged. I mean, it was just not even in the realm of possibility. The thing, though, I would say, especially business school graduates are an ambitious lot, and you're all sort of saying, when am I going to be a CEO? My only advice there would be, it's like, don't wait for your next job to do your best work. That, I think, is the crux of it, which is if you think about every job you get as the most important job and as the thing that is perhaps your last job, but you gave it all, and of course, from there, a lot of things will happen. And that's at least how it was not like the job that I had before becoming CEO, I somehow thought was just a stop on the way to something else. I actually thought that was a fantastic job until, I got the next job.
And that next job was ultimately to become the CEO of Microsoft. And when you took that job, you faced some high expectations. Microsoft is struggling. You're following, as you mentioned, Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer. And many people thought that the CEO should come from outside. So what did you draw on in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a consummate insider. I've grown up at Microsoft now 28 years. I also recognize, to your point, that I was taking over from Steve and Bill. And Steve, even though was not a founder, he had founder status in the company. Bill and Steve built the company. Bill and Paul founded the company. And The one thing that perhaps I was more grounded, having worked with them, is as a non-founder CEO, I needed to make explicit some of the things that I think founder CEOs can take for granted, because founder CEOs can carry, just because of who they are and what they mean to the organization, a lot, and telegraph that very broadly and have followership. Whereas I describe myself as a mere mortal CEO, I felt I needed that sense of purpose to be deeply rekindled as something that I reinforced. And culture, both sort of these two pillars of sense of purpose and culture, needed to become much more explicit. For example, when I joined Microsoft in '92, we used to talk about our mission as putting a PC in every home and every desk. It was pretty inspiring, right? I mean, you could even do an Excel spreadsheet, P times Q. It was easy to compute. And except by the late 90s, we had more or less achieved that, at least in the developed world. And since then, we had this struggle of what's next. And I felt like I needed to sort of go back, in fact, to the very origin of the company, right? I mean, Microsoft got started when we built, or Paul and Bill built, the basic interpreter for the Altair. And I believe that everything that needs to be known about Microsoft in 2019 can be traced back to our origin, which is we build technology so that others can build more technology, right? I felt like we were doing things out of envy and others. We needed to get back to what our core identity is, right? Especially in 2019, where every company is a software company around the world. We can just basically be a software platform and tools provider and have a good business. And so I felt, let's be proud of who we are. Of course, we got to express it differently. And then, really reinforce that. That's why we talk about our mission around empowering people and organizations. The other piece, though, is we had to work on our culture. I distinctly remember, I guess it was '98 when we first became the largest market cap company in the world. And many of us, who were lucky enough to participate on that wave of growth. But I remember that day when we walked around, you could see in in campus, people thought, wow, we must be God's gifts to mankind. Right? We're so smart, we're so good, look at us. And except that was not the case. I mean, the case was, it's a temporal thing, and it only matters. What matters is your ability to learn, grow, be grounded in the realities, and our customers and what have you. And so that's why I wanted a culture that stood for that learning organization. And in fact, my wife had introduced me to a book by a Stanford professor, Carol Dweck, which I'd read, Mindset, many years before I became CEO. It was a huge influence in our household as it relates to our own children's education. But quite frankly, it was a great education for me, because when I read that book, I realized that notion of growth mindset applies to individuals like me. It applies to companies like Microsoft. So we took that meme of growth mindset and said, look, let's not be know-it-alls, let's be learn-it-alls. And has been a very helpful part of, I would say, our journey around this, what is a cultural meme that we can even make first class, that we can have a real dialogue on.
Absolutely. And you talk a lot about this cultural shift. In looking back at that over the last 5 years, what was the most difficult part to change? Because you instilled growth mindset, you did all of these things, but what were the hardest roadblocks?
Look, I mean, I think it's always, it's a challenge. It's one thing to say growth mindset, because sometimes people will come to me and say at Microsoft, Satya, we found the 10 people who don't have a growth mindset. The point about that, it's not about going looking for 10 people. Yeah. It's about me being comfortable with confronting my own fixed mindset each day. And that's the hard part of it. When you say you're a learning organization and you say, we've learned that here are the 10 people who have not learned, then that's a problem. And I think that's the reality of it, right? How do you bring about long-term change? I mean, I'll say one other thing. One of the reasons why I feel at least we have some momentum. I'm very, very careful not to sort of paint this as some destination we will reach or have reached for sure. It's going to be something that every day we're going to have to confront our fixed mindset. We're always going to be imperfect. There is going to be a gap between what is our espoused sort of culture and what is the lived experience. The question is, are we working to bridge that gap? And it's very uncomfortable, especially in business where everything is graded by, how close to perfection are you? To say, let's be imperfect and celebrate imperfection is just a hard thing. And that's why leadership at the top, setting the tone, walking the walk, I think is the hard part. But, anyway, that's the real, I would say, challenge of being able to implement change at scale.
Absolutely. And you want to set this culture of a growth mindset where people can take risks and make mistakes and learn from them. And you want to walk the walk. When have you had to lead by example on this front?
Well, I mean, every day I would say, but I would, in some sense, the decision one makes for me, the ability to sort of take diversity and inclusion. Saying the words, saying we're going to make progress is one thing, and then to recognize that progress has to be something that really has to come from one's own first change in behavior, right? And take the everyday experience of the senior leadership team meeting itself. It's an interesting thing. Every time I question myself on everything that we talk about as what we espouse that is more broadly applicable across the company, how much of it is represented in the behaviors, starting with me, of our own senior leadership team? We have some very, very amazing women who are part of our leadership team. Are they participating like anybody else? And in fact, am I allowing for them to be able to really make sure that we are listening to them, they are able to feel like they're driving the company? And starting with that type of sensibility, which, by the way, is not constant, but at least are we pushing, is sort of the way I think I remind myself of how important, to your point, about it sort of putting it everyday practice. We have three things that are the cultural I would say pillars for us, right? One is diversity and inclusion. The other one is customer obsession. And then the other one is to bring the company together as one company as opposed to, fragmented set of P&Ls. All three of these are just super hard, easy to say, but require everyday practice, starting with me.
Absolutely. And I think diversity and inclusion is an interesting one because it's a topic that can invoke a lot of defensiveness. So to apply a growth mindset to that area is particularly powerful. Yeah,
for example, the thing that we have recognized is you have to do a lot of things here. For example, we even changed the compensation of our senior leaders, starting, even mine, to ensure that we take this as a huge priority. You could say, well, is the compensation change the real thing? I'm not saying it's the only thing that needs to change, but it's an important thing. I myself had perhaps not recognized that measuring things, having a real metric around it, and then compensating is a good sort of start on a lot of fronts. And so, but the thing that we've come to realize is every intern class that joins Microsoft every year is more diverse than the previous one. But then they look around and say, well, where's that diversity, in the company? And so that means the real currency of a culture is inclusiveness. And that, I think, is the core job of what leaders do and what is the everyday experience of, what happens at Microsoft. Interestingly enough, I've also come to recognize that first level manager has probably the most influence on what happens. And so I distinctly remember as a lead at Microsoft with 5 people working for me who all were thinking, why is this guy leading us, right? I mean, it's always the case because the first level job is the hardest job because there are 5 people who are also just recent graduates who are sort of looking at you and saying, I can do what you do. And then you have a boss who's asking you to do many things. And so it's sort of real pressure cooker in the sense you sort of really have to, do a lot. But that's when your attitude, your nurturing of that 5 people who are working for you around inclusiveness will matter a lot. So one of the things that we're doubling down is, are we truly supporting managers, at all levels, to be able to sort of, in fact, support their team so that they can bring the best out of them and then have them feel included as part of the company.
So we've talked a lot about culture. Let's shift and talk a bit about strategy, and particularly the cloud, because today we sort of take the cloud for granted, but when you took over, it was still far from a sure thing, and you made this bold bet cementing Microsoft's strategy in the cloud. How did you rally others around that vision when many were convinced it wouldn't work?
I mean, our challenge with the cloud was we had a very, very successful business in what was the client-server era. And sort of you look at any P&L that says, oh, here's a new business. By the way, it's got gross margins that are sort of 1/4 of this gross margins of the current business. Oh, and it'll be good. It's hard to sort of look at those kind of transitions because all rationality says that, you should avoid it as much as possible. And except in tech in particular and many other businesses, these transitions are secular. They're inevitable. And so the question is, how do you make that transition? And that's where I must say Steve, when he was a CEO, was the one who gave me permission. And the decision he made was, look, we got to go after this. And one of the things that I've realized as leaders, and many of you in your careers are going to make these kinds of decisions, we are all about solving these over-constrained problems, right? I mean, classic over-constrained problem is, you have a huge profit margin, and now you got to go build a new business that sort of replaces this business. And by the way, you should have the same gross profit margin. And guess what? It's not possible. So someone, somewhere, has to remove some constraint. Who does it? Leaders do it. So he removed the constraint called gross margin. He said, go win this market. And that's what was then made it possible for us to do all those things that have now gotten us to the other side. But to me, I've learned a lot from that. So in fact, if anything, I feel like as a leader, sometimes, you get to speak from both sides of the mouth, right? Which is, I need growth and I need profit. In many cases, your job as leaders is to, in fact, unconstrained, take on the risk. In fact, in the first multiple years, Amy Hood, who's my CFO, and myself, we said, look, let us take on the risk. And then actually metric a lot of our leaders more on customer satisfaction, usage, versus profit, revenue even. And I think that that's sort of the type of decision-making one needs in order to make these harsh transitions.
And when you look back and you look at all that you've done on culture and strategy and making this bold bet, are you able to tell which one moved the needle more for Microsoft's renewal?
I fundamentally believe that strategies or markets will always be coming and going. There'll be lots of changes. I'm a fundamental believer in that sense of purpose and culture as the two pillars that are necessary in order to get a lot of other things right. Of course, if you don't get your strategy right or your ability to sort of ride a particular wave of innovation, and especially in tech, it's pretty harsh, right? I mean, it's very hard to recover. But that said, though, the question is, what is it that will give you the best probability of even catching those? And to me, that sense of purpose, which I think is a reflection of what you're innately good at as an organization, right? It's competitive advantage, except it's codified in that identity. And culture is what that allows you to express that identity with new opportunity.
I think many of us in this room want to use our careers to create impact at scale, and you have committed almost 30 years to Microsoft, which seems unfathomable to many of us. How do you think about...
It flies by.
How do you think about intrapreneurship and this idea for those among us who maybe want to work in large organizations to create change in the world? What advice would you have?
Yeah, look, I think that, all organizations, small or large, all have amazing opportunities. But I'll make the case for a large organization, and especially an organization like Microsoft. I mean, think about it. If you want to have impact at scale, in fact, one of the reasons, there are two things. When I'm trying to recruit at a college, I'm always telling people, like, hey, look, if you want to be cool, go join somebody else. But if you want to make others cool, join Microsoft. And I say that because I believe that, which other organization will be able to have in 190 plus countries the impact on small business productivity, public sector efficiency, multinationals in any part of the world and their competitiveness globally, health outcomes, education outcomes. This is scale at enormous rate. And so therefore, if you want, join a company like this, but then you have to have the following, I would say, sensibility. Guess what? You got to work with others. In other words, that's, I think, a key important skill. Like, what does it mean? I mean, you do a lot of that. Many of you have got a lot of work experience even before coming to business school. But fundamentally, to do anything useful and big and at scale, it's all about teams. Teams inside or teams outside, that's what it takes. And the second thing that you also need is to realize that, a lot of people talk about the matrix and the complexity of large organizations. That's again the case. I mean, even for small companies, you just have a different type of matrix. You'll have a VC, you'll have a board, you'll have customers. So you're never going to escape working with people. You're never going to escape bringing multiple constituents together. And I think that you should pick whatever size of organization, recognize that scale only comes because you've been able to bring many constituents together.
You say that we can never escape working with people, which brings me to my next section on AI. You are a big proponent of AI, and you believe that AI will be good for humankind. And you argue that in an AI future, human traits like empathy and creativity will be more important than ever. And yet, in some ways, technology has made us less connected. So how do you see AI augmenting humanity rather than detracting from it?
Look, first of all, I'm excited. I'm going to spend some time with your own work around this human-centered AI and the work you're doing there. I think it's so important. Here's how I come at it. First, before we get into some of the unintended consequences of AI, one of the areas that I am deeply involved in is accessibility, right? I mean, think about what AI has done to people who need the most help, right? Say if you have ALS, now with eye gaze, you can type and communicate. If you have visual impairment of any sorts, you can interpret the world by using the latest in computer vision. If you have dyslexia, by using some machine reading and comprehension techniques, you can start teaching a middle school kid how to read, because reading then leads to their participation in our economy. So I would first say some of AI and AI capabilities are helping more of us participate fully in our societies and in our economies. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be clear-eyed about the consequences of AI, right? The first one is, what are the ethics of AI? We as, in fact, creators of these platforms and tools have to before we even get to sort of the big topic of ethics, improve the state of the art of the software engineering around AI so that things like bias and so on are being dealt with. There's this fantastic line I love of Rilke's, which is, he talks about how the future enters in you and transforms itself in you before it becomes real. So we are creating AI. It's humans who are creating AI. So we get to shape, what the craft of creation of AI looks like. How we design systems where the human is in loop. We get to decide that as a society even, what we are comfortable with and not comfortable with. So I don't want to abdicate all of that, and feel like this is just going to happen outside of our control. So that's at least how I think about it. And also on the employment side, I do believe that, for example, this... is it zero-sum? I don't think that is the case. I think that there will be more jobs. The question is, how do we really use, in fact, all of the sort of levers we have economic and social, to skill people for the jobs that are going to be there. And many of those skills might be different types of skills than the ones that are valued today. For example, there's no reason why our society can't have wage support for teachers. In a different way, in a world where there's a lot of abundance of AI doing a lot of other things for us, or artists, or what have you. So therefore, I think we will come up with mechanisms, I hope that we have, and in fact, more than hope, I feel that we shouldn't abdicate our responsibility to control our own future that I think we all want to live in.
And given Microsoft's vision to democratize AI, there are concerns about what might happen if those tools get into the wrong hands. And you've just mentioned not to abdicate that sort of responsibility. So how do you think about who to partner with in light of those concerns?
Right. I mean, there's multiple things. So one is, what is it that we ourselves will do to, in some sense, have some core principles that define what we do and then who we work with. Take facial recognition. That's quickly becoming the topic which I think is going to even have regulatory frameworks around it. In the state of Washington, we participated even in creation of that regulation. So I think that first, before even the regulation is in place, we have guidelines on what we think is the right use, because the maturity of the models really make it only sensible to use it in certain use cases and not in others. And being clear about it, and then ensuring that that's what we do, and then working, knowing that there will be, like there's food safety, there should be AI safety. I mean, there will be regulation. And we should be okay with it. In fact, if anything, our practices and our data of what's good, what's not, what's the state of technology should inform that regulation.
So you bring up the topic of regulation, and today it seems that relationships between regulators and many large tech companies are fraught. In its early days, Microsoft may have fought its own battles, but today Microsoft is leading with openness. And so what's your advice for the aspiring tech leaders here on balancing that pressure to grow as a company with your responsibility to society?
That's an interesting question. Here's what I've at least learned. In fact, Brad Smith, who is another colleague of mine who recently wrote a book called Tools and Weapons, he reflects, because he was very much he worked with Bill, he worked with Steve, and now he works with me, very much part of our own struggle. I would say the one thing that at least I took away from that time is when there is, I would say, a lot of criticism of whatever it is that you're doing, I think that it's appropriate for us to look in the mirror and perhaps learn about what it is that we're being criticized about. And perhaps there are changes that we need to actually bring about. So I would say scrutiny of large organizations is absolutely something that is going to only happen, and I think large organizations should welcome it. And we all can learn from it. And the core, though, especially in technology business, we collectively as an industry have to just mature at a very fast rate, because the impact of digital technology in our lives and in our society is so deep now that for us to assume that we're just going to have unfettered access to all parts without thinking about the unintended consequences of this technology are long gone. And so therefore, for us as an industry, for us as a company, to both recognize the opportunity of these technologies and the responsibilities, whether it's in security, whether it's in privacy, whether it's in AI and ethics, I think is going to be central. And these are not going to be terms of competition even. I think this is where the industry at scale has to get a lot better. And I think that moment is upon us, and I do see positive change. But it is definitely a time for self-reflection and change.
So I want to circle back to your own leadership style and values. And what strikes me is that you seem to combine this sense of self and ability to stay true to your leadership style. You even have a story of Steve Ballmer telling you it's too late to be different, with, on the other hand, this real belief in a growth mindset. And I think for many of us at the GSB, there's this question of how do you stay true to your own style while still knowing when and how to grow in the right direction. And so how do you think about those two things?
I think the ability to understand yourself is actually, it's a lifetime's journey, right? It's a journey of your lifetime to really unpack who you are and what you're good at, what makes you tick, what are your passions, is something that, what makes you happy, the question that my mother asked me all the time. And in fact, the older I get, the clearer I am in understanding even what she was asking. And then to be able to understand others. That's also another journey of a lifetime, right? Which is you sort of feel like you understand what others are saying, you understand where they're coming from. I think that's really what is going to perhaps help you with both be true to yourself, your identity, what makes you tick, what makes you happy, while knowing that ultimately I think a lot of that satisfaction you get is because of your ability to empathize, the ability, it could be your family, it could be your workplace. That's the other thing that I've come to realize, we can be transactional at work. I'll tell you, there was this gentleman, another GSB grad whom I worked for, Doug Burgum, who's actually the governor of North Dakota nowadays. But there was this time, in my mid-30s, he said something to me which just had a profound impact. He said, look, you're going to work, at Microsoft more time than you are going to even spend with your kids. And I said, oh, wow, that's pretty, that sounds pretty harsh. and yet it is true. And his main point was you better think about work having deeper meaning than being transactional. And as I've thought about that, the only way it's not going to be transactional is when you relate to people you work with. That's what you'll remember. The projects you worked on, the technologies will all be passé in time, but the people, what you did, how you behaved, what was I take great pride in these people whom I've mentored or go on to do great things. That's the relationship that I think you seek out while being true to yourself and what makes you happy.
And you mentioned humility earlier and how important it is to you. And you have this quote that says, when everyone is celebrating you is when you should be most scared. And I think it's safe to say that people are celebrating Microsoft's renewal. So how do you keep yourself and your teams grounded among this success?
That's a great question. There's this book I recently read by David Brooks called The Second Mountain. It was an interesting book because he talks about it mostly in the context of us. There's that first mountain, which is what perhaps many of you as graduates of GSB are going to be on, and you're going to seek excellence and success in the professional career. And then you're eventually going to get to that second mountain, and then you're going to sort of, in his words, relate to the world and community and what have you. And I feel that that's really what's there for Microsoft. The way, having gotten to whatever high market cap in '98, now for us, it's more not our market cap, but what is our market cap leading to? To your point, it's if you celebrate our success, but fundamentally realize, if you sort of go back to our mission and our business model, right? It's not even a sense of mission and purpose that's somehow abstracted away from what's core driving our business model. We need to see success all around us. That's it. And so if we celebrate that small business in Kenya, or that large multinational in Sweden, or that public sector company in Indonesia or in Vietnam, that's what's going to help us be grounded and be successful. And so that invoking of that everyday sense of purpose is what I think is going to help us the most.
Thank you, Satya. And I think on that note, we will turn it over to some questions from the audience.
Okay.
This thing on? Hi, my name is Tar Karadpir, and I'm a first-year MBA student. And I'm asking this question in conjunction with my classmate, Jeff Kruger, who unfortunately couldn't be here, but we're both interested. You've mentioned that at Microsoft, you've made a principled decision that you're not going to withhold technologies from institutions that have been elected in democracies to protect the freedoms we enjoy. This position, as you probably know, stands in contrast to a number of your peer tech companies here in the Valley. Can you elaborate on your decision framework as CEO to have Microsoft pursue U.S. Department of Defense contracts like the Jedi Cloud project at DoD?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, one of the things that we're engaged in is with deep respect for all opinions that people may have on things that we should be concerned about. But on this one, we've been very clear from day one on the statement you read out, which is I feel that I have great belief in our democratic institutions and our democratic process. And one of my big fears is that somehow CEOs or corporations try and substitute for what I think in the long run is the most important thing for us, which is our democracy to work as designed. And in this case, if we don't like what our government does, we have this one great opportunity, which is we get to change, we get to vote, we get to even take principled stance against our government if we do think that that is something that we want to fight for. In fact, Microsoft, whether it's in the previous administration or this administration, we've had cases. It was the warrant case around privacy is something that we were able to go fight, and then ultimately, through the Cloud Act, bring about change, which was a bipartisan legislation, which I feel is a good step in the direction of having privacy enshrined in a legislative sort of set of processes. So that's how I look at it. I don't see how withholding technology from, as I said, the institutions that we have elected that are subject to civilian control ultimately to protect the freedoms we enjoy is going to help. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have ethical principles. We shouldn't advocate for ethical principles. And in fact, these institutions that we are talking about have perhaps more of a history around these ethical principles as well. And so for us to rely on that and reinforce that, I think would be important.
Hi, Satya. Hi, I'm Prashant. I'm from Hyderabad. A second-year MBA student.
Good city.
It's a great city. So my question is, today, if you were a 22-year-old engineering graduate from India, would you stay back in India and work in the tech and startup ecosystem, or would you come to the US, and why? And if you come to the US, how can we all think of contributing back to our home country?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I really, literally, growing up, never thought I'll ever go outside of Hyderabad. I had very self-satisfying sort of goals in life. I wanted to play cricket and work for a bank, and things changed. So I feel that the opportunity, whether it's in India or rest of Asia or in Africa, we've just created 2 development centers in Africa, both on the west and the east side of coast of Africa. There is great opportunity. There's great talent. I think digital technology in particular is a real democratizing force. We were talking even backstage about how even when the rest of the infrastructure is challenged, there is very novel ways for digital technology to overcome some of those things because of the most malleable nature of software in some sense. So therefore, I think there's opportunity everywhere in the world, but at the same time, for you to come here, learn from learn in a place like the GSB and be inspired and go back is an opportunity I would take if that sort of came about. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that that's the only opportunity ahead to have impact. It's interesting you bring up because globalization, let's face it, is going through a little bit of a challenging phase. And I think that it's deserved in some sense because the globalization was celebrated to a point where the inequities that were getting founded, I guess, or inequities that developed in local communities were not addressed. Whatever happens in this next phase of globalization will not only, in fact, help that grand convergence of opportunity all over the world, which was, by the way, a very good thing in that first phase of globalization, but also address the local inequities, whether it's in India or in Palo Alto. I think that's what I think is needed, whereas there is real innovation that brings equitable growth everywhere, is perhaps the opportunity for GSB grads in 2019.
Does this work? Hello. Hi, I'm Casey Uhlenhut, an MBA too. I also worked at Microsoft before I came here. I think I might be the only one. .NET team, let's go.
That's great.
I was just wondering, in your rise to the top, what was the biggest adjustment you made to your leadership style as you moved up in the company?
It's interesting. I must say, there's many dimensions. Perhaps the biggest adjustment was that ability to grapple with what is it that uniquely only you can do versus what others in the team can do. Getting much better at it was the most helpful. But the CEO job, when I look back at it, and many of you who may start out and and become even CEOs much earlier on in your career, I had not understood, perhaps even growing up at Microsoft, how multi-constituent the job is, right? I mean, that's perhaps the biggest adjustment I've had to make, is recognizing it's about customers, it's about partners, it's about all your employees, it's about your investors, it's about governments, it's about many of these constituents. And by the way, it's not about it's not like office hours for each one of them. It is about all of them, all the time. And how to think about that multi-constituent world, I think, is perhaps the biggest adjustment that one makes as you grow in any organization. And the faster you grapple with it, the better off you will be and your organization will be.
So we'll now turn it back to our traditional lightning round. And I'm going to... Don't be scared. We're changing it up a little bit this time. I'm going to ask you to complete a few sentences for me. So, I feel most energized when?
I see someone very excited about the impact of what they're doing.
What keeps me up at night is?
What wakes me up in the morning.
Good dodge there. I am most grateful for?
The sense of the love, the affection of people that have had the good fortune, whether it's my family, whether it's the people I've come across at work, the organizations that I'm involved in. It's just such a blessing. When I look back, that's the thing that sort of really I'm most thankful for the people in my life in all spheres of it.
The most important piece of advice I could leave this audience with is
the piece of advice that Steve Ballmer gave me when I became CEO: be bold and be right. Which is, if you're not bold, you're not going to do much of anything. And if you're not right, you won't be there.
Satya, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you.